All right, so today I'm going to walk you through 5 things I wish I had have known that would have progressed my photography like crazy when I was just getting started. Anyone that's just starting out with photography probably wants to be taking better photos, and if I had had these 5 tips when I first started, would have made things a whole lot easier. So let's kick things off with tip number 1. So tip number 1 is to focus on the background. Now, I don't mean to focus, like actually adjust your camera's focus to be focusing on the background, but what I mean is just to take a notice of what is behind your subject. I see this so many times, and this is something that I suffered from a lot. I would go out, I would shoot, I'd take photos, my subject looked great, but there was just something off about the photo. And it wasn't until years later of taking photos that I was out shooting with someone that had just started taking photos, and I noticed it. They were trying to take photos of me and they just couldn't nail it for some reason. Something just felt off, and time again, it was the background behind me. If you can find interesting shapes, interesting repetitive patterns, or whatever the case, or maybe it's just light, make sure you're focusing on what is behind your subject, as that is going to have a huge impact on your photo. It's not all about the subject, and sometimes the background can make the photo entirely. I'd strongly recommend for a background that frames your subject well or just complements your composition in general. I've got some photos on screen now that hopefully kind of convey that message, if you will, but if you're just starting out, make sure you're focusing on what is behind your subject and not just your subject alone. Next up on the list is something that I fell victim to pretty much the first day that I ever opened Lightroom, and that is less is more on the edits. I see this so much, so much. And if you scroll back far enough, because I've left it all public, you can see the edits that I was putting on my photos back in 2018, 2019, and even in early 2020. They were insane, believe me. Editing in Lightroom is an absolute blast, and it's so fun kind of learning how far you can push an image, and maybe you can take a daylight shot and turn it into colors that look like it was shot at sunset. That's fun. However, when you're really starting to get good and you're really starting to take photography seriously, less is more. The idea, and something that I've always referenced, is you want to kind of just enhance reality when you're photo editing. You don't want to go crazy, unless that's your style, but very few people can pull it off and make it look good. You just want to be trying to enhance reality. I think that over editing your photos is one of the quickest ways to stand out as a beginner photographer, and that will mean less respect in the photography community for your work. And also, if you're looking to monetize your photography at all, clients will be less inclined to go with you because your photos just look out of this world, and that's not always a good thing. So do yourself a favor, don't push the sliders and the curves especially, too far, and make sure that you're always keeping in mind that you just want to be enhancing reality and not pushing things way too far. All right, next up on the list, and this is something that took me so long to work out, but that is to zoom in. Now, when I first really started getting into photography, I was shooting with the Canon 5D Mark III and a 16-35 f2.8. Now, that is an incredibly good setup, and I love both that lens and that camera, but that is an incredibly wide camera setup, and I don't have much flexibility to zoom in and really focus in on just one thing in a wide scene and kind of snipe out a composition. And that's what I think is so important for a lot of photographers to try and do. See, when you're shooting nice and wide, it's great and it's fun. You can capture everything in one photo, but you get to a photo location, you snap a few photos, maybe 3 or 4 really wide images, and then you're kind of done. You can't really be... there's nothing else to find. You've just shot a wide landscape, or maybe it's a really wide portrait, whatever the case, and you're ready to pack up and go home. At least that's how I felt when I was shooting everything super wide. I'd get to a location, I'd walk around and try and find the best compositions I could. I'd shoot maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 photos at most, and then I'd be done with it. And then I started zooming in. I started shooting with lenses like the 70-200, the 24-70 even, and you don't have to have the highest end, latest, nicest versions of these lenses. You can also get the cheaper versions as long as you can just zoom in. And that changed everything. All of a sudden, I was sniping out really cool compositions in really large, wide, expansive landscapes. I was able to really focus in and just take little bits of parts of images that I liked and make them cool photos, and that's when everything changed. All right, tip number 4 is something a little bit more daunting, and that is to make friends. Of course, Far easier said than done, but making friends inside of the photography community is going to see your photography progress skyrocket. I'd strongly recommend to do this by just going on Instagram, finding some people in your local area with somewhat of a similar following or maybe even a similar photo style to you and reaching out to them, getting in their DM, getting in their comment section, following, engaging with their work, leaving tips, leaving feedback, whatever the case, just making a network and a community of local photographers in your area that you can reach out to and lean on maybe when you're hitting a photography block or when you need actual feedback on your work and you can't just ask your family because you know all they'll say is, yeah, Zach, it looks great. And you're like, come on, I need a little bit more than that. One of the first times I noticed how important it is to have a good community of photographers around you is when I first went to Bali when I was 19. I had 3 weeks there and I was solo. I had no friends with me whatsoever. I was just there with my camera. And day one, I decided to just DM pretty much every single person that looked like they could be a photographer in Bali to meet up, shoot, get a coffee, get lunch, breakfast, dinner, whatever the case. And that changed everything for me. All of a sudden, I went from knowing absolutely no one to knowing maybe 5 to 10 people that were shooting, and they'd invite me out to go and shoot. I'd invite them out to go shoot. We'd send photo locations to each other. We'd go and edit side by side in cafes, and this changed everything. Skip about 3 years ahead after that trip to Bali, and I actually moved in with someone that I met on that first trip, and we shot together like crazy. We got along like no tomorrow, and all of a sudden, I had someone in the same industry and same niche that was trying to make it just like I was, and we were able to bounce ideas off each other like crazy. So if you haven't already, I would strongly recommend to go out there, make sure you're posting your work on Instagram and you have somewhat of a presence on there. You don't need a giant following, and just start to engage with people online, and everything will change as soon as you start to get a good community of photographers around you. Something that I see a lot of photographers do is box themselves into either being a landscape photographer or a portrait photographer or a food photographer or an automotive photographer, whatever the case. And I think that that's great once you've really found your groove as a photographer, but when you're just starting out, you need to shoot absolutely everything. I found it really limiting to only be shooting landscapes when I first started out with photography. And little did I know, I actually loved shooting street photos. I loved capturing images on the street of people doing things and weird things going on that otherwise you wouldn't notice and would just kind of drift away in the background if you were just walking down the street. But the thing is, I would have never worked out that I loved shooting street photos if I had to just box myself into being a landscape travel photographer, and that was all I forced myself to shoot. Now that's one positive that'll come from shooting different styles of photography, but the other one is you will level up as a photographer like crazy. See, the thing is, if you go from shooting landscapes to like food or products in a studio, you are all of a sudden going to be in an environment where you are forced to take good photos in a place and in a scene that you're just not used to performing in. And this is where you will really start to understand how your gear works, how your cameras work, where your lenses' strengths are, and where your strengths and weaknesses are as well, and where you need to be able to improve to kind of get to that next level as a photographer. So if you haven't already, I'd strongly recommend to go and throw yourself in the deep end, go get uncomfortable, and just go and shoot a load of other styles of photography, find out what you like, and find out where you can improve as well.